The king is one of our closest allies, one of our most reliable partners, not just in the Middle East, but globally. And the conversation that they undoubtedly had was potentially quite consequential.
Well, and the conversation itself could be uncomfortable when you consider what ask the president is making here. He wants Jordan, together with Egypt, to accept millions of Palestinians into the country so that Gaza can be redeveloped. Is there any way the president is going to be able to convince the king that that is a suitable plan today?
Well, my guess is that the king probably behind closed doors thanked the president for at least demonstrating concern for the welfare of the people living in Gaza, which a lot of people don't seem to want to express, and to try to think about new ideas, because frankly, new realities do require creative thinking. Now, this may be more creative than people are prepared to swallow, but at least it's a beginning of a conversation. And I'm sure if the king were able to offer ideas of his own to complement what the president is offering, then there's a conversation to be had.
So that's my question for you. They're back behind closed doors now. To what extent can King Abdullah bring Donald Trump into his fold and talk about the stakes in the region and why this may be asking the impossible?
Well, again, in my experience, a lot of presidents, and I don't mean this as criticism, it's understandable, don't necessarily know all the details and all the problems that led us into these dilemmas that we face, like today. So that's one task, I think, for the king, is to explain the realities on the ground. And for Jordan, there are two realities. One is they already have been generous, and 60% of their population is Palestinian origin. And there is a Jordanian East Bank population that is rock solid with the king. They are his base, but they don't want one more Palestinian. So that's a political reality. The second problem is that the whole issue between the Palestinians and Israelis is largely now, to summarize, one of land for security. And so the Palestinians are loath to give up their land without any kind of guarantees about what they keep. It's the land. The dispute is over the land. And so if the king were to come along and cooperate with a proposal that deprived them of that, he would be viewed as a traitor.
Well, and the president has suggested that Palestinians wouldn't necessarily be welcomed back to Gaza, that they would be in nicer conditions, in his view, elsewhere. He suggested as well, when he was asked by a reporter, that the U.S. does have the authority to do this, to just go into Gaza, not buy it, he says, but just take it over as its own. What authority is that, Ambassador?
Well, the legal status of Gaza is a little bit nebulous anyway. It's not just a matter of law or authority, but also what our interests are. And I think our interests are to work carefully and wisely with the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Arabs to come up with a solution that will improve the welfare of the people living in Gaza, but also get us back on a path toward finding a durable solution.
The president indicated in a conversation with reporters last evening that he would be open to threatening, at least, to pull some funding from Jordan. I don't know if you take him at his word there, but what would we be talking about? To what extent does Jordan rely on U.S. funding? We certainly know how it relies on military support.
Right. We provide over $1 billion a year to Jordan, so it's quite substantial, but we do it because it's in our interest, not necessarily because it's in Jordan's interest. It is, of course, as well. But we do it because the King of Jordan and the government of Jordan and the army and the intelligence services are solid partners. This is an island of moderation on Israel's eastern border. And if we risk put in jeopardy that support, it puts in jeopardy the stability of the monarchy. And I think that would be an extremely dangerous course to take.
Well, and we should remember as well, last year when Iran sent the barrage of missiles and drones over to Israel, it was the U.S. and U.K. that were helping take those down. But Jordan air defense, Jordanian air defense was involved in that too. Obviously, that is just one of the players we're talking about here, though. There's Egypt as well. And King Abdullah said, we need to see the Egyptian plan too. Are they on the same page, the two of them together? Will Egypt be viewing this any differently?
Well, Jordan will probably seek an Arab consensus for any outcome, and obviously it may serve his purposes to hide a bit behind the absence of an Arab consensus to support this. It's the Saudis who will really matter, and they've already rejected this proposal. But, you touched on a very important point, which is that Jordan is an ally of ours in dealing with the Iranian problem. And so a lot of this is, frankly, a distraction from the real issue, which should be strategically, how do we do something that permanently puts Iran the reversal of fortune that Iran has suffered. How do we make that permanent? And Jordan has a big role to play and a lot at stake in that. And so I hope they're also discussing some of those issues.
Ambassador, this is all further complicated by Donald Trump's threat for all hell to break out again, starting at noontime Saturday in Gaza if hostages are not released. He indicated just now he doesn't expect them to be released. To the extent that you know King Abdullah, what does he make of talk like that? And what might Gaza look like at noon on Saturday?
Well, my interpretation is just, as valid as anyone else's, but was that the president was speaking about his expectations of reality, not necessarily that he was threatening that or he wanted that.
But that would mean the ceasefire agreement is out the window.
That he believes that if we don't finish phase 1, there won't be a phase 2.
Yes.
And if there's no phase 2, there will be a resumption of the war. So that's a statement of fact. And I think King Abdullah also understands those facts. So we should be doing what we can to sustain the ceasefire process. Mm-hmm. The problem there is that phase 2 of the ceasefire calls for the withdrawal of the IDF fully from Gaza. And yet there's been nothing done to prepare for what replaces that. Who or what will be providing security in that context? So the Israelis are not going to pull out if they don't have a reliable partner on the other side of the fence, which is not Hamas and not the Palestinian Authority. The Arabs have said, well, we can do it, but only if Netanyahu commits to a two-state solution for the Palestinians. And there's no consensus in Israel for something like that. So phase 2 is in serious jeopardy, not because of what President Trump said, but because of the realities of these differences.
So even if you don't see a break in the ceasefire on Saturday, when this 42-day period is expired, you don't see a likelihood that it's extended beyond that if phase 2 is the requirement for that?
I think it's very fragile and very unlikely to happen, in my opinion. I hope I'm wrong. But it would require certain either changes to the agreement or compromises on the part of Israel that in the current psychological climate, I think are extremely unlikely to happen.
I want to ask you about a story that broke a short time before you joined us here. The Kremlin has freed Marc Fogel, a man who has your former job, actually, Steve Witkoff, put him on his private plane as they are apparently on their way back outside of Russian airspace. So we can now talk about this. Mike Waltz made this clear. This is the first time that a senior U.S. official has touched down like this in Moscow since the former CIA director Burns touched down to try to head off a war in Ukraine. To what extent does this development help to pave the road for a deal over Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, he was my predecessor, but I didn't have a private plane to bring into the equation. My experience with President Trump in his first administration was that he cares passionately about the fate of American citizens who are being detained unlawfully overseas by governments or terrorist groups. So I think this is a plus. What we don't know, of course, is what the conversation was and what, if any, trade was made in exchange for the release of this man. We don't know that, but undoubtedly it will become apparent soon.
Well, what does it say that the Middle East envoy is the one who was sent to Russia to do this?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that, except that I also believe he's a close friend of the president. Sure. So it may be on a personal basis that they all felt that he had what it took to get the deal done.
Does it give you hope on the relationship, or at least the ability to negotiate with Moscow when you hear a development like this? Usually this doesn't happen in a vacuum.
That's right. And so in that sense it's positive, but we don't know what it is that Putin got in return. And so I would want to know that before I made any further judgment.
Well, and we also have to consider the relationship that these conflicts have with one another. We're talking about the war in Ukraine and Russia, which obviously has ties to Iran. China is involved in this as well. It's often described to us on this program as a new axis of evil. How do these puzzle pieces fit together in your mind? If Russia's going to the negotiating table on Ukraine, does it have implications for the behavior of Iran? What role does China play in this, for example?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's watching everyone. And Iran has developed an alliance, at least of convenience, with Russia and China. So that's a factor as well. But I think Russia is definitely on the defensive in the Middle East with the collapse of their ally in Syria.
Sure.
So I'm not sure that it has any immediate implications. But for the United States, what we do in one theater of operations and one set of problems that definitely influences attitudes toward us in coping with other problems. So the idea that we're going to assert strength, peace through strength, actually works. And that is, I think, a foundation of Trump's approach.
What about the idea that we could just go in and take over Gaza? What might that signal to China about Taiwan?
It's a good question. I don't have an answer to it, but I accept that I don't really believe it's going to happen.
Well, I'll tell you what, when you start to pull out the lens here and look what's happening in the region, we recall the visit by Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House last week, and people were musing openly here in Washington about a preemptive attack against Iran, that is what Bibi was trying to talk to Donald Trump about. Iran on its heels, go after the nuclear facilities now. Is that something in the realm of possibility for you, or is that talk at a cocktail party in Washington?
Oh, I think it's very much in the realm of the possible, and it was a theme for many conversations between President Obama when I was Middle East envoy and Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was in office then. And that was part of the incentive and motivation for us to get the nuclear deal that was flawed deeply, but something that we got. So I'm sure it was discussed, and I'm sure King Abdullah is very interested in knowing what exactly is
You think that's
store.
something that they're discussing today as well?
I hope so, and the King will be very happy if we're going to keep the pressure on Iran, but want to know how and to be ready for it. The fact is, Iran's air defenses, I think, are apparently gone. And so this is a good time to think about how we can really eliminate this threat.